Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the World War II of Churchill's initiatives and schemes. Good idea, crackpot schemes or good ideas badly executed. And let's go to Force Z. Now, there is a whole different story around Force Z. There is different debates about whether or not carriers were assigned to Force Z before it went or not. There were carriers certainly planned for Force Z, but the fact is, when are they going to be available? For example, Indomitable, the earliest she could have been available, well, the only way she could have joined Force Z by December would have required her not grounding and abandoning her workup entirely and just going straight out there. There were various decisions about what ships should be there, whether it would be the Nelsons, HMS Renown, not Repulse, and our aircraft carrier, well, were Pound's original proposals. But Pound didn't envision such a force being available till spring 1942. He thought probably late January 1942 it was such a force to be available, maybe February. And he was basing that based on the availability of ships. Remember, by this point, when they're planning it, the Royal Navy's lost 2 fleet carriers. Well, 3 fleet carriers. They've lost Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal. They have lost 3 of their fleet carriers. This has a knock-on on availability. They've had Illustrious and I think Formidable damaged. It again has a knock-on on availability. It has a knock-on consequence. You're fighting a war. You don't have all the assets you want. Again, it's one of those interesting scenarios if you go into back in time and you do replace Courageous, Glorious, and Furious with Admiral class battle cruisers as the basis of those carriers, well, they had better underwater protection from the get-go and were far better designed to resist torpedo attacks. So, at least one of those might have survived. You'd also hope that as they'd be bigger, much more important ships, even in that period, due to their size, able to carry far more useful air group, they would have had a more major escort. So you'd hope that perhaps there wouldn't have been the scenario to happen. They would have certainly been admiral's ships, quite possibly, and in which case, rather than being Fisher's experiments, which no one particularly liked, they'd have been the equivalents of Hood, but carrier form. So they'd have been admiral sailor ships. So they might well have had been a flagship, in which case, if there's an admiral aboard, it's unlikely they're going to use it for anti-submarine warfare. It's even more unlikely it's going to go steaming off on its own without a proper escort. And if the captain says, "Yeah, no, sir, I don't. I've had a dispute with all my air group officers. I'm not going to be flying any aircraft," the admiral will probably do this. At which point the captain has an option of going, "But I think actually we should be," or carrying on. In which case the admiral will be doing this. At which point, if the captain continues going on doing something silly, then the captain will find themselves no longer the captain, and the executive officer will find themselves suddenly the captain. There are plenty of examples in British history of that happening. There are plenty of examples in other navies' history of that happening. Flag captain is a very important role, and if you muck it up, you can be replaced quite quickly. So, this leads us all to Force Z. And again, the debate between Churchill and Pound. Now, the debate is primarily on where the ships are going to be based. Pound had proposed that the moment that war started, the Nelsons, Renown, and any aircraft carrier at Singapore, was his original plan, would be withdrawn onto Ceylon. Because it would not be a large enough force to be competitive with a major portion of the IJN. So therefore it had to be withdrawn, so it would be a deterrence force, i.e. they wouldn't know where it was. And this is again for spring 1942. This is the real problem. Force Z, Force Z, whatever it is, however you pronounce it. World War II in the Far East starts way too early for the British. Actually, it doesn't. The British were thinking about war in the Far East in 1942 to 1943. That's when they were sort of had an idea. They hoped for 1944-45, but they were prepared 42-43. They were not expecting World War II to start in 1939 in Europe. They were expecting a couple more years. They thought they had more time. They were building their fleet based on the idea of having more time. They'd accepted the 1936 London Treaty. They'd accepted all sorts of things based on the idea of having that time. And Churchill's a factor in all this. Churchill is a factor in all this. Churchill has actually been agitating against the treaties. In many ways, he's been saying we need to rearm more and faster. But again, when he's first Sea Lord, and he comes in World War II begins, what's one of the first things he does? He doesn't remember the lessons of the First World War. He gets into power. He stops the building of the big ships. He pauses it to concentrate on escorts. Because this is not going to be a long war, but it is going to be a submarine war. Did the man learn nothing from World War I? It wasn't a short war. It was a long war, and yes, you needed a lot of escorts, but by golly, could we have done with some extra battleships as well. And certainly extra aircraft carriers. I can understand to an extent the pausing of the battleships. There is no one in the European side of conflict who can outmass the British in terms of battleships. And if Rodney and Nelson are halfway worked up, there isn't anything that's going to match them. The only thing they can do is keep away from them. But aircraft carriers, you should not have stopped. This is the man who had championed the Fleet Air Arm, had championed the Royal Naval Air Service, had championed aircraft carriers, and he allows the aircraft carrier production to be paused. Indomitable is laid down in 1937, is launched in 1940, and laid down in November 1937, launched in March 1940, and commissioned in October 1941. She is one of the illustrious class aircraft carriers. Now, if we consider her predecessors, they're all ordered in 1937. Illustrious is laid down in April 1937, launched in April 1939, commissioned May 1940. So, from start of construction to completion, that's 37 months for Illustrious to build. Formidable, next one, 41 months. Victorious, 48 months. And Indomitable, 47 months to build. So we are looking, at least two of those have almost a year added onto their construction time by the pause. They're all started in 1937. April for Illustrious, June for Victorious, June for Formidable, and Indomitable November. Indomitable is being built by Vickers Armstrong, the same people who are building Illustrious.
So the odds are, yes, she's slightly bigger and built to modified design, and yes, there are changes which are they take advantage of the pause in building to put in. But come on. It shouldn't take that long, that much longer. It's because of the pause. So again, we're talking about Force in December 1941. Let's say that you still have a bit of a pause. But if you cut 6 months off that pause, she then enters service not in October 1941, which is a lovely month, but it's also the 10th month of the year, but in April 1941, in which case she would have been worked up and available. And Victorious enters service in May 1941. Well, she takes 48 months to build. Take 6 months off that, she's back in 1940. And let's say Formidable is held up for just as long as she is and still takes 41 months to build versus the 37 of Illustrious, which is also held up. Okay? They are launched. The real key date is the launching date, which is a different number. Their launch time to commission, again, for Illustrious, is 13 months. Formidable, 15 months. For Victorious, 20 months, and Indomitable, 19 months. So, launch to commission. Again, longer. 6 months longer between launch and commission. But, where are they really held up? Well, it takes 2 years from laying down to launch for Illustrious. She's laid down in 37. She's launched in April 1939. So, that's roughly what we'd expect for each ship. Remember, the carriers do have armor, but they don't have anything massively significant. They're complicated, but it's not huge chunks of steel. It's more personnel hours and commitment. And yes, they start to focus on escorts when war breaks out. But they start to creep up. Formidable takes 26 months. Victorious, 28 months, and Indomitable, 28 months. So, Indomitable takes 28 months from laying down to launching, which puts her level with Victorious at the longest time to take that. And then she is second to Victorious, which takes 20 months from launching to commissioning. Indomitable takes 19 months. And all this extension is down to the pause on carriers at the beginning, pause on cruisers, carriers, capital ships at the beginning of World War II. This is why Force Z as it happens. This is why you have the issues Britain has, because at the point at which really it should have been ramping up carrier production, and you would have thought Churchill, the father of the Royal Naval Air Service, the person who pushed through the tank, the person who had been as committed to naval forces as anyone in the world, and who was so obsessed with flying he'd actually taken flying lessons and wanted, all these things. You would have expected him to go, hang on, no, I don't mind you pausing battleship construction. There are a huge amount of commitment. We did at the beginning of World War One. I can understand it, and yes, lessons will be coming in, and yes, okay, if we have to pause it, we pause. But we cannot pause aircraft carrier production because we need as many of them as we can get. Because if you put it down to, and I said, even Illustrious, she is delayed by this pause and takes 37 months. So let's put them down to about 3 years construction. You would have had Illustrious come in a month earlier, commissioned. So she would have been commissioned by April 1940. Which would have been interesting, because if Illustrious comes in April 1940, Well, that's when the Norway campaign is really taking off, and she comes into service in May, but if she'd come in April, she might have actually played a factor into that. She certainly could have been an interesting addition. If you take Formidable down by 6 months, well, not by 5 months, so take it down to a build time of 36 months. So 5 months off. She's completed in November. Well, instead of November, she'd have been June 1940. Victorious, that's a full year earlier. Instead of May 1941, she'd have been commissioned in May 1940. That's useful. You now have 3 carriers completed in 1940. And honestly, the same happens with Indomitable. Take the 47 months takes the build. Take 11 months off that to get her down to 3 years. And, well, she's completed in October 1941. She would be completed in November 1940. Yes, let's say you still lose Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal. Hopefully you wouldn't, but let's say you do. Well, having those ships entering service on time would have erased that completely. And it's not just those 3. This is the point. The Implacable class have similar things going on. They are laid down in March and November 1939 each. They're completed in 1944. August and May 1944. The Indefatigable actually manages to overtake Implacable. Again, if you put them down to 3 years, they should have been being commissioned in 1942 when they were being launched. Okay? Implacable and Indefatigable are launched in December 1942 after having been laid down in March 1939 and November 1939. That's more than 3 years for each one of them from laying down to launch. It then takes almost 2 more years after that for them to be completed. In simple terms, these ships take the best part of 5 years to finish what should have been a 3-year build, arguably because they are so delayed at the beginning. And it takes time to get momentum to start off, and by the time you've got them going, you're then wanting to put in a lot of changes. So that takes more time instead of building new ships. So 4C. 4 said, it is important to send a naval force out there, and everyone agrees. But the reason people are saying no to carriers going isn't because the British do not want to put a carrier out there. Isn't because somehow the British have ignored the lessons of Bismarck, Matapan, Taranto, Mers el-Kabir, all these battles which they have carried out, and do not know the level of power which aircraft can now wield over ships. It's because they don't have the ships for all the commitments they have. And the reason they don't have the ships for all the commitments they have is because, in the nicest way, the decision was made to pause construction of carriers and other capital ships. Pausing the battleships, I prefer you not to, but they are big, big hogs of equipment and material. And you have a lot of them. You don't have a lot of aircraft carriers. And when you lose ships, it becomes worse. we could have had Britain could have had three more carriers in service a lot earlier. They could have had 5 more carriers in service a lot earlier in World War II. In fact, HMS Illustrious itself, so they could have had all 6 of those armoured carriers in service far quicker. We then consider the Audacious class. They're even more absurd. They're laid down in 1942. And if we consider HMRO5, Audacious then becomes HMS Eagle, laid down in 1945 at Harland Wolff in Belfast. This is Belfast, not exactly one of the places. I have to admit, it's not completely safe in World War II, and there are attacks and all that, there are issues. But it's not exactly on the British East Coast. And she is not launched until 1946. So almost 4 years. She's not commissioned till 1951. 9 years. If it had been a 3-year from build to laying down to commissioning, as they could have probably done, and what had been managed with Ark Royal, in fact, they're pretty much definitely a dead on our 3 years for Ark Royal almost, from laying down to commissioning. Which, yes, they're in a war, so maybe a delay also, but a delay of a full year? No. And not due to a pause. But especially as they're ramping up in wartime, they could have done it. They could have kept them to 3 years. They could have had a couple of Audacious class commissioning in 1945 to go to the British Pacific Fleet. Even HMS Unicorn. Even HMS Unicorn, it suffers from this. She's laid down in June 1939. She's launched in November 1941. Yes, she's the simplest ship, and it takes 2 years and 5 months to go from laying down to launching. She's completed by March 1943. Another 16 months later. HMS Unicorn. Pretty much a light fleet carrier. And if we consider how well the light fleet carriers turned out by the British, we know she could have been completed a lot quicker. Another one who, 3 years, so June 1942, she would have been entering service. HMS Unicorn around for a full year more of war. I can't think what they'd have done with her. So, you all thought you were going to log in and get this 4C, and I was going to be ranting about the deployment of the battleships and where they should have been positioned. Well, no, Pound was right. They should have been withdrawn to Ceylon. That's where you should have been basing your fleet, because that would have been beyond range for the Japanese to engage, but also would have allowed Phillips to choose when to engage, i.e., to reinforce Singapore, rather than to have to go forward and engage the enemy fleet at Singapore. He would have been able to pick his moment. It would have also been better to have had those carriers in service, because if they hadn't been paused, you could have had one, maybe have rapidly deployed another carrier out there. 2 carriers, 2 battleships of this sort of level, maybe get a third battleship out there with that second carrier, if you have those ships in service, you can do that. You can't do it otherwise, but you can if you've got those ships in service. At which point, maybe you form up Abda again. But this time it has 3 battleships and 2 aircraft carriers at its core. Suddenly, though, that difference in cruisers and torpedo strength of the fleet, it doesn't seem quite the same level of an issue. Especially as those carriers can launch night strikes. Could probably take out the Japanese a lot further away than their torpedoes can take out the fleet. You'd also have a different command structure involved because you had Tom Phillips, who was by no means an idiot. A very capable officer in many, many regards, and certainly not the anti-air power curmudgeon that's often pursued by some. And all this comes down to that decision at the beginning of the war to pause construction. Again, 37 months. 37 months is also what HMS Ark Royal roughly takes to build and commission. So you can say Illustrious is pretty much peacetime, almost construction. But it should be roughly 3 years, 36 months. And the build time of the next 3 in the class, 41 months, 48 months, and 47 months. No Indomitable wasn't available and wouldn't be available for 4C in time. But she should have been. Yes, she wasn't available in time, but she should have been. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you found it interesting. Decisions have long-term consequences, and that's what the moral of this one is.